Thunder on the Right by Alan Crawford. Read by Fax Fivem. Chapter 10, Crashing the Democratic Party. Opening with the following quotes. Conservatives must learn to disregard meaningless party labels. From Richard A. Viguieri. If you can't lick 'em, join 'em. Old adage. The cherished goal of the New Right, repeated throughout its literature, is to forge a new majority, a grand coalition which, no longer encumbered by sentimental allegiances to such presumably outmoded institutions as the Republican and Democratic parties, can sweep the New Right to power. There exist, the Right contends, millions of Americans who are New Rightists by instinct, waiting for the opportunity to be liberated from their traditional loyalties and ignorant of the choices for freedom the Right offers. Much of the New Right's activities in the late 70s were devoted to forging this new majority. New Rightists had already made inroads into the traditional conservative domain of the GOP. Key to the new effort is the invasion or infiltration of the Democratic Party. Unhappy Democrats whose loyalty is only to name can keep the name. The New Right wants only their votes. Those regarded as most valuable include Roman Catholics from the urban Northeast, who are concerned about the creeping ghettos and busing to inner-city schools, and opposed to abortion and sexual permissiveness. Born-again Protestants, especially from the Southern Democratic hinterlands, who are alienated by the increasing urbanization of values, big government, and big business. Disaffected Wallicites within the labor movement concerned about taxes and recession, and blacks who have achieved middle-class status and are now as concerned as middle-class whites with inflation and crime. The New Right observed, for example, that labor union members voted for George Wallace in '68 and Richard Nixon in '72, abandoning, at least in their voting for presidential candidates, their traditional Democratic loyalties. Many workers, revolted by the New Left and the counterculture, refused to vote for the Democrats and '72 presidential nominee, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. Hard hats clashed with anti-Vietnam War protesters on Wall Street in the late 1960s. Working families were appalled by the hippie police confrontation in the Chicago streets during the 1968 Democratic Convention. Great cracks, it appeared, had opened up in the Democratic coalition, cracks the New Right watched with close attention and considerable expectation. They are paying similar attention today to further tensions within the Democratic Party, hoping to gain, for instance, from the volatile hostility that developed between Jewish voters and American blacks, fed by affirmative action and surfacing dramatically when Andrew Young was forced from his position as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. They see promise, too, in the conflict between white labor unionists and black workers over hiring and promotion and seniority. Fax Fivem here, and I would like to just give a little bit of context for, well, I guess any younger listeners who might not be as aware of these events. So, 1972, South Dakota Senator George McGovern was completely trounced, winning only the state of Massachusetts. Let's see. Next up is the Hard Hat Riots. Now, the Hard Hat Riots were a series of riots in New York City in which construction workers, nicknamed hard hats for their, the helmets they wore on their head, they broke police lines and attacked a bunch of anti-war protesters. One thing that was kind of interesting for at the time is that people noted that the hard hats teamed up with the kind of Wall Street types, even though those two groups of people, the working class and the literal capitalists on Wall Street, didn't usually get along. In this case, they did get along specifically to target their perceived enemy, a bunch of hippies. Let's see. Okay, the 1968 DNC was held in Chicago. If you actually look it up, if you Google a police riot, which is a riot that is caused or at least exacerbated by the police, I guarantee you're going to find the 1968 DNC in Chicago used as one of the, if not the, examples. The police were kind of effed up, but most people still took the side of the police anyway. Okay, let's see, next up. Okay, the Andrew Young thing, hang on, let me just check his Wikipedia page. Okay, yeah, so, in July of 79, Young discovered that an upcoming report by the UN Division for Palestinian Rights called for the creation of a Palestinian state. Young wanted to delay the report because the Carter administration was dealing with too many issues at the time. He met with UN representatives of several Arab nations to try to convince them the report should be delayed. They agreed in principle, but insisted that the Palestine Liberation Organization also had to agree. As a result, on the 20th, Young met with the UN representative of the PLO at the apartment of the UN ambassador from Kuwait. On August 10th, news of the meeting became public when Mossad leaked its illegally acquired transcript of the meeting to Prime Minister Menachem Begin and then through his office to Newsweek. The meeting was highly controversial since the United States had already promised Israel that it would not meet directly with the PLO until it recognized Israel's right to exist. So yeah, I guess is referring to. Oh, right. Sorry, I should have specified that Andrew Young. Well, he's actually still alive. He is a black man, an African American male from. Looks like he's from. Where was he born? Oh, he was born in New Orleans, but it looks like he was also mayor of Atlanta, Georgia. Ain't that neat? Oh, wonder what he's up to now. Oh well. Let's see, affirmative action. I think you all know what affirmative action is, although at this point in time they were just kind of trying it out. You know, my take on affirmative action, I honestly don't think it's as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. Because, well, I mean, just think about it for a second. If you apply for a job, the only people who know what happens to your resume are, you know, the folks behind the scenes. For all I know, they could just be throwing darts at a dartboard and picking whoever's resume that the dart pins. I mean, does affirmative action discriminate against white men? Maybe it does. Like, I honestly don't know, and I don't think anybody really knows, because it's just such a black box what happens to your resumes and applications after you hand them in. Well, alright, back to the book. The right-wing constituency is those whom political scientist Donald Warren has called the radical center, those alienated, forgotten, angry, and troubled Americans who are ripe to engage in backlash politics, and distinguished from the rest of society by their suspicion and distrust of it, by the belief that others are engaged in a conspiracy against them. These Americans are uniquely unable to make common cause within the established system, ill-equipped to engage in the give-and-take politics of cooperation and compromise that coalition building requires, more attuned to social protest than to the complex process of governing, deeply distrustful of the very nature of coalitions. They put principle above party. But if the alienated can become the society, the core becomes the majority, so the new right leaders hope. The so-called new majority has been described by William Rusher as a union of economic conservatism, the dominant secular faith of the American middle class, and of social conservatism, predominantly a movement of the lower middle class and portions of what would have been the American proletariat if its behavior warranted that Marxist term. Its appeal, therefore, is powerful among those who work with their hands, hard-hat industrial workers, small farmers, and the blue-collar population in general. Because of the ethnic character of the migratory waves that filled these important ranks in the population, social conservatives in the northern states are drawn particularly heavily from Catholic ranks. Not only Irish Catholics, who came first and are now widely absorbed into the middle class, and thus into economic conservatism, but Polish, Czech, and other East European Catholics, and, last but far from least, Italian Catholics as well. Murray Friedman has written in Overcoming Middle-Class Rage, 1971, ironically, while Middle Americans have formed largely the natural constituency of liberals in the Democratic Party historically, it was conservatives in the GOP who first grasped the meaning of their revolt and took steps to capitalize on it. The battle plan for the victory of conservatism in 1968, the combined vote for Nixon and Wallace, was 57%, was drawn by Kevin Phillips. Exploiting the anxieties of these Americans, Nixon and Agnew did much to invade traditional areas of Democratic liberal strength, and talk of the breakup of the New Deal coalition became common in political circles. New right theorists are convinced that the old coalition that united the South, the Northeast, segments of the Northern, Middle, West, blacks, lower middle-class Americans, labor union members, and liberal intellectuals is disintegrating, leaving only the liberal intellectuals and what M. Stanton Evans has called the welfare majority. The South, which voted for Nixon and Wallace in 1968 and Nixon in 72, could be salvaged by the Democrats in 76 only by nominating a Georgian. The Georgian he's referring to is then President Jimmy Carter. Labor and black success in Oklahoma City. When the New Right needs a demonstration of its ability to gain broad-based support from labor union members and blacks, they invariably present the case of Mickey Edwards, a Republican congressman from Oklahoma City. Edwards likes to boast about his success in garnering votes of black and working-class Democrats. He told the 1979 CPAC in Washington, with a touch of sarcasm, "Good conservative Oklahoma, people think, the home of Fred Harris and Carl Albert. Well, in my district, the registration is 3-1 Democrat. I was the first Republican elected from it in 48 years. We have enough of a labor vote that although we have right to work in Arkansas, in Texas, and in Kansas, all around us, in Oklahoma, 3 times organized labor has defeated right to work." In addition to a strong blue-collar constituency, Oklahoma's 5th District also has a large black community. Roughly 11% of Edwards' constituents are black. There are large numbers of black elected officials and an influential black newspaper. An amiable right-winger who once edited the American Medical Association's monthly journal, Private Practice, Edwards ran for Congress in '74 and, like many Republicans in that post-Watergate year, he lost. He ran again in '76, squeaking into office with a meager 51% of the vote. But 2 years later, he won re-election by a landslide, taking not only every blue-collar precinct but every black precinct as well. He won, for example, Del City, a suburb with a high concentration of federal employees. His pre-election polls, taken by conservative pollster Arthur Finkelstein, showed that his strongest single base of support was in households with at least one labor union member. Here I was, sitting on this strong base of support, having gotten just 49% of the vote. You listen to Bill Brock. You know what I had to do, right? I had to move to the left. I had to broaden my base. Here's how Edwards broadened that base. During his first 2 years in Congress, he became an officer of the American Conservative Union. He received nearly perfect voting ratings from the Right-Wing Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress. He was one of 2 floor leaders in the House fight to defeat common sightist picketing. His record on labor issues was so poor that it provoked the AFL-CIO into naming him as one of the shameful 7 in Congress. To gain ground with black voters, he said he opposed the District of Columbia Voting Rights Amendment, tried to cut CETA funds, and fought a minimum wage increase. I was against every single thing the Black Caucus wanted, he admitted. A bit of context, just a second. Alright, so common sightist picketing is the picketing of an entire construction site by a trade union having a grievance with only a single subcontractor working there. And then CETA, C-E-T-A, is the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, which, let's see, okay, it was a U.S. federal law enacted by Congress, signed by then-President Richard Nixon, to train workers and provide them jobs with in the public service. All right, it was repealed by Ronald Reagan and replaced by the Job Training Partnership Act. Hopefully that gives you some more details into some of these topics. When the votes were counted, Edward picked up 80% of the vote. And this, the right says, is proof that without compromising its principles, they can win the votes of blacks and blue-collar workers. What they do not say about Edwards' victory, however, suggests that much of their optimism may be wishful thinking. Edwards had astoundingly weak opposition. His opponent had spent only about $500 during his primary campaign and won his party's nomination, according to one of Edwards' campaign aides, simply because large numbers of Democrats turned out to vote against his unpopular but better-known opponent. Edwards' opponent was not even taken seriously by local Democrats in the election itself. Neither the United Auto Workers nor the AFL-CIO's Committee on Political Education gave money to Edwards' opponent. Edwards' former administrative assistant told me that, "In essence, we were unopposed." Edwards was considered such a shoo-in by Republicans that his re-election campaign did not actively seek financial support from the well-heeled New Right PACs. It was one of the few contests involving New Right candidates that year, in fact, in which the right-wing dollars from outside the state did not play a major role. The Edwards campaign, which used the services of Richard A. Viguerie in '76, conducted its fundraising drive without Viguerie in '78, and even the well-padded National Conservative Political Action Committee, crucial to Edwards' '76 victory, felt that Edwards was such a shoo-in it did not contribute, giving money to races where they felt the money would do more good. Nevertheless, Edwards did actively court Oklahoma's strong black vote. He hired black staff members and, breaking GOP tradition in the district, established a campaign office in the heart of the city's black community. Edwards was endorsed by the influential daily Black Dispatch. Black voters who supported the Democratic candidate for the Senate crossed over to vote for Edwards for the House. The Youngstown Roadshow. On February 1978, New Right leaders, in an effort to broaden their somewhat narrow constituency, trooped off to Ohio to express solidarity of sorts with the laid-off steel workers of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Plant, led by Congressman Edwards and Philip Crane of Illinois, and accompanied by Viguerie, Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, Howard Phillips of Conservative Caucus, and William Rusher of National Review. The New Right delegation held secret closed-door meetings with local labor leaders and came back to Washington bursting with good news. The Unionists, they reported, were deeply angered about the shutdown of their factories and the loss of their jobs, and the source of their anger was the federal government. The New Right leaders told members of the press corps that the Unionists complained of injury to the investment climate caused by unfavorable tax laws, industry's inability to absorb the mounting costs of production imposed by government regulations, lack of a national energy policy geared to production rather than consumption, and inflation caused by deficit financing. These are the same concerns that New Right leaders express, as Edwards explained. They were saying in order to compete with foreign steel, we need modern equipment. We need to be able to realign the blast furnaces in our steel mills and to get newer, better equipment. And we can't do it because our companies cannot go into the market and borrow money because the money isn't available. Now I swear to you, Edwards concluded, that sounds like you were talking to top management, but these were the labor people. They are extremely conscious of the fact that the government is eating up all the money. At the 1979 CPAC, Edwards said that the Unionists, who also protested congressional failure to balance the budget, we were dumbfounded. We had to explain to them that we agreed and were fighting to balance it like they wanted. Viguerie announced that, as a result of the meeting, he was planning a massive direct mail campaign to go directly to the homes of Unionists across the country, designed to counteract the effectiveness of the AFL-CIO. Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress simultaneously announced workshops to train congressional candidates to appeal to blue-collar constituencies by stressing shared concerns: jobs, excessive environmental controls, busing, abortion, gun control, and the like. As Congressman Crane put it, "Before the century is out, we will all see the battle lines that are being drawn, those who work for a living and those who don't." If all of this proved true, it would, in an amazing political reversal, put conservatives and blue-collar labor on one side, ranged against liberals, so-called labor bosses, bureaucrats, and welfare families on the other. No one, of course, can really know whether the claims of the coalition were based on fact. Despite the enthusiasm of conservatives who attended, it has been next to impossible to locate a single union member who will admit he attended. One local labor leader refused to comment to the local press, and others denied being anywhere near the meeting. The labor press was generally hostile to the whole affair, and Stauchen Lind, colonial historian and New Left hero, now a labor lawyer in nearby Niles, Ohio, dismissed the meeting in a letter to me as definitely not a big breakthrough or opening or anything. If nothing else, the meeting was a media event. Jack Anderson devoted a column to it, and it was mentioned in U.S. News and World Report. At the very least, it spread the impression that the new right is trying to work with like-minded blue-collar Democrats, and, in politics, perception of events can often be as important as truth. The Youngstown outing was only part of what was once intended to be a major effort to court the labor union vote, but it was effectively countered by the leadership of the labor unions. In 1977, the AFL-CIO produced and distributed a film titled The New Right Machine, shown to local union members and alerting them to the advances of the New Right and portraying it in terms as lurid as anything in the New Right's own fundraising letters. The literature of the labor movement in the late 70s bristled with articles on the New Right, so that many rank-and-filers now know the name Viguri and are alarmed by the New Right. In The Evolving Threat of the New Right, a pamphlet of the labor-oriented League for Industrial Democracy, Arch Puddington wrote the following. The New Right likes to talk about its concern for the needs of working people, a line that has gone down fairly well in the general media. But the fact is that conservatives have devoted as much sweat and money towards defeating situs picketing, legislation promoting right-to-work laws, and fighting labor law reform legislation as it has towards somewhat better publicized issues like the Panama Canal Treaties and the Equal Rights Amendment. Ironically, Republicans are more likely to make inroads among labor Democrats from the relatively sophisticated approach of conservative New York Congressman Jack Kemp, who stresses issues of deep concern to unionists, but which represent neither old-guard Republican business interests nor New Right reaction. The issue facing this country, and especially its backbone, the working men and women, transcends all these political and ideological labels. The issue is whether we will have economic growth and opportunity or contraction and unemployment. The issue is whether people will look forward to the future with hope and optimism, or despair at the prediction of Alfred Kahn that there is no way we can avoid a decline in our standard of living. All we can do is adapt to it. The administration thinks we have inflation, apparently, because too many people are working too much. Business is doing entirely too much business. Consumers are consuming too much, and producers are producing too much. So this administration's answer is for everyone to do less of whatever it is they're doing, especially holding jobs. Telling workers to settle for 7% while the government devalues the currency at 13% is robbery. Republicans are quick to defend the profit incentive, but the wage incentive is no different. Take away either incentive and you ruin people's hopes and lives as you ruin the economy. The answer for business and labor is economic growth, which can only be stimulated by lowering the tax rates. We haven't had a president since Jack Kennedy who understood that. We are either all move together as a country or we don't move at all. Kennedy says a rising tide lifts all boats. Economic growth benefits everyone. Kemp, the former football star, is gaining greater credibility among working-class Americans than the glib New Rightists, and winning a limited acceptance of his ideas among Americans who would otherwise associate Republicans as business trouts, opposed to labor's interests. Whether this approach benefits Republicans or merely finds certain acceptance among Democrats remains to be seen. Bypassing the ghettos. The New Rightists also believe that their program has great appeal for blacks who have achieved middle-class status and are presumed to be ready, out of concern for inflation and crime, to vote for right-wing Republicans. And so they make gestures in the direction of blacks, quoting whenever possible black neoconservatives like Thomas Sowell, a professor of economics at the University of California at LA, and Walter Williams, a professor of economics at Temple University. In articles supporting a sub-minimum wage for teenagers, right-wing columnists like John Lofton have deplored the high unemployment rate among young blacks, as if a sub-minimum wage would ease their plight. But talk is as far as they've gone. The New Right, with the possible exception of a small number of politicians like Congressman Edwards, has done nothing substantive to attract black support and seems not unhappy with the lack of support it receives. Moreover, the right has criticized the genuine efforts made by the Republican Party to attract blacks, initiatives taken not by conservative Republicans but by party moderates like Republican National Chairman Bill Brock. When Brock asked Reverend Jesse James of Operation PUSH, or People United to Save Humanity, to address a meeting of the Republican National Committee, Lofton attacked Jackson, saying the following. Despite what he says on black self-employment, the Reverend has denounced capitalism as a bad system, enthusiastically endorsed reverse discrimination, calling for quotas in jobs and college admissions for women and minorities, criticized President Ford's efforts to reduce federal regulation of businesses, and urged passage of a massive multi-billion-dollar federal public service jobs program. How in the world could any Republican candidate get the Reverend Jackson's vote by endorsing these things without turning his back on the traditional GOP philosophy as regards to those issues? The answer is obvious. There is no way. The circle cannot be squared. And when Brock announced that the Republican convention of '79 would be held in Detroit, a Democratic stronghold with a large black population, the right-wingers were outraged. New rightists seemed content to sit back and wait for great socioeconomic changes to take place, after which they believe blacks will vote for the right candidates out of self-interest and without coaxing. These blacks, the theory holds, will become right-wingers out of a desire to keep what they have earned and will share the political and economic views of the GOP constituency. This theory assumes that the black middle class will be indistinguishable from white middle class. Evidence suggests the contrary. Charles V. Hamilton, Wallace Sire Professor of Government at Columbia University and a black political scientist, believes that the middle-class blacks, in fact, may be more liberal in their political and economic attitudes than the poorer black community out of which they have sprung. This emerging social economic group may well be infertile soil for the new right. Hamilton believes it would be a mistake to conclude that black middle-class attitudes on economic issues are similar to those of disaffected middle-class whites. What is important to examine, Hamilton told me, is not only that blacks have achieved middle-class status, but the nature of their relationship to the economy, and in this case, they are deeply tied to the public sector economy. He says that 67% of all black professionals and managers, compared with only 17% of the population as a whole, work for the government, and that of black administrators, 42%, work for the government. Black businessmen, he has found, very often started through Office of Minority Business Enterprise grants. Many were frequently involved in Great Society programs. Involved as they are in public sector employment, they tend to vote more liberal. Over a 12-year period, Hamilton studied 41 ballot issues in New York State to analyze attitudes on economic questions. Of all the groups examined, which included Roman Catholics, Jews, and other ethnic and religious groups, blacks voted to the left of all other groups. In fact, on every issue except housing, middle-class blacks voted to the left of lower-class blacks. Hamilton's conclusion that there is little reason to believe that blacks will vote conservatively on economic questions is supported by the results of referenda in the 1978 elections. Blacks in Michigan rejected by overwhelming margins 3 economic measures favored by the right: property tax cuts, property tax limits, and a voucher plan for school funding. In Missouri, they opposed a right-to-work law by 93 to 7%. The new right, indeed, like conservative and moderate Republicans, believes that the key to winning the votes of blacks of all economic levels is to stress private sector job creation and to portray as demeaning public sector employment. Evidence, however, again suggests this may not work. Blacks want jobs, period. Kenneth B. Clark, a black psychologist and author, told me. They don't care whether they're private or public. And they seriously question the sincerity of Republicans who say they want to ease black unemployment. As Clark put it, there is yet to be a Republican or conservative politician that I know of who has said, here is what we are going to do about black unemployment, and then lay out 1, 2, 3, 4, exactly what he's going to do, and until such time, blacks are not going to believe them. The right is correct, Hamilton believes, in noting that blacks tend to be more independent now than they used to be in their voting patterns and party registration. But this follows a national, not racial trend. Blacks are less democratic, but they are not more Republican. In New York City, black voters' registration in Harlem in 1965 was 85% Democratic, only 7% Republican, and 8% Independent. The registration of independents increased to 28% from 65 to 75, while the registration of Republicans remained roughly the same. The move is from the Democratic side to the Independent, but not to the Republican Party. Other observers deny that there is any significant movement of blacks away from the Democratic Party at all, noting that even if there were, blacks would still remain more solidly Democratic than any other group in the country. And in those cases in which blacks have voted for Republicans, the new right has not gained. They have done so only when the candidate offered by the GOP is more liberal than that of the Democrats. The Joint Center for Political Studies, a black-owned think tank in Washington, in its recent study, Election 78: Implications for Black America, acknowledged a new voter independence and sophistication among black Americans, suggesting significant implications for coalition building, especially between black voters and white Republicans. But the chief beneficiaries of this new independence, based on the results of the 78 contests, would appear to be liberal to moderate Republicans. When Illinois Republican Senator Charles Percy defeated right-wing Democrat Alex Seif, Percy won a healthy 32% of the black vote. In Pennsylvania, Republican Richard Thornbow received 52% of the black vote in the gubernatorial election, beating right-wing Democrat Pete Flaherty, once mayor of Pittsburgh. These statistics showed issue discrimination, not narrow party loyalty among blacks. In Tennessee, GOP Senator Howard Baker won 12% of the black vote in his re-election bid. Baker at the time was under severe attack from the GOP right for supporting the Carter administration's Panama Canal treaties. In Mississippi, GOP right-winger Thad Cotrain capitalized on the decision by Fayette Mayor Charles Evers to seek the Senate seat vacated by James Eastland, running as an independent. Evers' 23% of the vote, which included 95% of the black vote, drew off enough support from the Democrat candidate to give Cotrain the victory. Evers' role as the spoiler thus allowed Mississippi to elect its first Republican to state office since Reconstruction. But explicitly rightist candidates did poorly compared to their more liberal and moderate GOP counterparts. John Warner in Virginia won only 9% of the black vote. Jeffrey Bell in New Jersey won only 7% of that vote. John Tower in Texas, 5%. Strom Thurmond in South Carolina, 3%. And Jesse Helms of North Carolina, 2%. The dominant attitude of the new right towards blacks is that expressed by Patrick Buchanan in a column that carried the headline, GOP vote search should bypass ghetto. American blacks, Buchanan argued, have been grossly ungrateful for the efforts already made in their behalf by Republicans who by now have done more than enough to seek their support. Recent Republican administrations, he wrote, were hardly years of oppression for black America. He noted that between 1969 and 76, a record number of blacks moved into middle and upper-level civil service jobs, with the Nixon administration's Office of Minority Business Enterprise helping scores of blacks to start their own businesses. Like Lofton, Buchanan believes the time has come to stop trying to compete with the Democrats for black votes. The GOP won the White House in 1968 and 1972 without them. While it would be inaccurate to attribute overt racism to much of the new right, the appeal to fears about busing and quotas and welfare can play on racial anxieties. The disgruntled Wallicites, who are an important part of their constituency, express considerable status insecurity that for some Americans has a racial base. The new right, at least, seems unquestionably insensitive to the interests of black Americans, quite unlike the traditional conservatives who have taken great pains to disassociate themselves from groups like Wallace's American Independent Party. Barry Goldwater, for example, in The Conscience of a Conservative, declared integrated schools wise and just, and helped integrate the Arizona Air National Guard and the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, although he and other conservatives opposed quotas in the 70s and desegregation in the 60s, believing both to be unwarranted instances of social engineering by the federal government. Such positions, though taken with good conscience, pleased racists on other grounds. Because racial justice to many others seemed to depend on governmental enforcement, conservatives were often thought callous or worse and were so accused by liberals. Never was the insensitivity of the new right better dramatized to me personally than during my stint as an editor of Conservative Digest, when we were preparing to publish an article about Clay Smothers, a black Wallicite. One of the editors emerging from his office presented the following headline, which he obviously was quite proud of. Clay Smothers, a black of a different color. I politely suggested that I doubted very seriously if I were Clay Smothers I would be honored by the headline. It was eventually changed to the following: a black conservative champion. Less snappy, perhaps, but probably less offensive. Rebels in Southie. Urban Democrats are, like blue-collar labor union members, middle-class blacks, born-again fundamentalists, and other groups with grievances, the targets of the new right in their effort to crash the Democratic Party. In a small, drafty storefront on a gritty street lined with rundown bars in a Boston working-class Irish Catholic neighborhood is the South Boston Information Center, headquarters of Southie's foes of so-called forced busing. On the front of the building hangs a sign. A city is occupied. Boycott exists. A tyrant reigns. Law is by decree. People are oppressed. The spirit of freedom still lives. Beside it, painted on a green shamrock, are the words, "With our last breath, we'll say never." Inside, near the rack of right-wing pamphlets, is another slogan. To conquer South Boston by force is only to make a temporary conquest. The South Bostonians even have a song to express their commitment to the cause, a ballad whose lyrics they distribute with copies of a recorded version to the tune of Galloway Bay. Oh, the planes that fly from Logan over Southie, they just see those crowded houses down below. But the people living down there in those houses have a spirit that the strangers do not know. For the strangers came and tried to teach us their way. They scorned us for the things that we hold true. But they'll never break the backs of our resistance or force us to do what they want us to. Jimmy Kelly, a friendly but hard-nosed neighborhood organizer and former dock worker who is the organization's president, sits behind a cluttered desk towards the back of the chilly building. He reminisces about his youth in Southie and what it means to him. Look, when I was a kid, and this is the same for kids growing up around here through the generations, every kid I knew had one real dream in life. Every kid wanted to go to South Boston High and play football. You have no idea what that meant to us. People around here have loved South Boston High. Everyone went there, and it means something to us now. Now it's not possible anymore. Kids from Southie aren't allowed anymore. Every time there's an opening at South Boston High, it's reserved for a black kid. Kids from Southie have to be bussed out of the neighborhood and go somewhere else. That's heartbreaking. Something very special's been taken out of their lives. And look at the job situation. Kids growing up around here like this neighborhood, and they like to stay here, get married, and someday buy a house in South Boston or move into their grandparents' house or something when they die. For years, the jobs they all wanted were to be police or firemen. They could work here in the neighborhood and the pay was pretty good. Good job security. They could save their money and buy that house in Southie and then raise their kids there. That's all they wanted, really. But now the black kids get those jobs because of affirmative action. They get first pick. Our kids are shut out of the jobs, and you better believe it causes tensions. If there is more racism, well, what can you expect? Our kids see the black kids getting the jobs they feel entitled to, and they can't help but associate the problems with the blacks. But did the kids from Southie cause these problems? No! Judge Garrity did. The government did. They created the problems, and they've torn up a neighborhood that means more to the people around here than they can imagine. The right-wingers in Massachusetts even have their own monthly newspaper, the Citizens Forum, dedicated to individual freedom under God, limited government, and free enterprise, which alerts readers to the activities of new right politicians. Representative Hansen seeks help to end union gangsterism. Worcester business leader sees conspiracy behind U.S. decline. And promotes Massachusetts new rightists like Avi Nelson and Edward J. King. As Gordon Nelson, a 6-foot, 6-inch Jewish stockbroker who is a Massachusetts Republican state chairman, told me, this state went from a governor in 72, but a lot of things have changed since then. When Mike Dukakis ran for governor in 74, he ran as a conservative, a cross between Reagan and Goldwater, even though he had a liberal voting record in the legislature. That's how much things have changed. On all the major social issues, he's a liberal, and after he was elected, he passed the largest tax increase in state history. Yet when he was challenged in his own party, it was from the left, from a McGovernite, and she only won 7% of the vote in the Democratic primary. But challenged from the right within his own party by Edward J. King, he was beaten. Man, liberal's a dirty word in this state now. Other tensions have contributed to the growing conservatism of Bay State voters, among them rapidly increasing property taxes, second only to those of California prior to the victory of Prop 13. In Boston, conservative ideas have gained great credibility, in large part because of the popularity of articulate television and radio commenters like Avi Nelson, son of a rabbi, and David Brudnoy. Like Nelson, a youthful Jewish intellectual who inherited Nelson's nightly talk show on WGN radio. Avi Nelson and Brudnoy enjoyed enormous popularity among the anti-busing forces, whose position was argued on an intellectual level by the two opinion makers. These guys have had a tremendous influence, not only among the people from Southie, but among the students too. Many of them didn't know intelligent conservatives existed, and they are intrigued by the intellectuality, consistency, and wit of people like Brudnoy, Gordon Nelson said. The language and temper of South Boston's Irish is not unlike that of the 1950s South, when white citizens, nostalgic for past times, fearful of pending change, loss of security and status, and the movement of blacks out of submission and passivity into competition with them in the schools, in jobs, and in neighborhood, resented each step forward with never. But the flinty Bostonians prefer to think of themselves as the American patriots of the 1770s, leading a ragtag and courageous revolt, a kind of modern Boston Tea Party against federal officials who, like King George III's colonial troops, have begun to tell them how they must live. The final irony, however, is that greater benefits seem to have been reaped by the Democrats than Republicans during this period of upheaval. The Democrats running right-wingers like King have picked up GOP votes without losing Democratic ones. In Massachusetts, many Republicans voted for conservative Democrat Edward J. King over moderate Republican Francis Hatch. As in Pennsylvania, Republican Richard Thornburgh defeated Democrat Pete Flaherty, and as in Minnesota, where Democrat Bob Short and Republican David Durenberger faced off after Short ran a right-wing campaign in winning a primary victory over liberal Democratic incumbent Donald M. Fraser. Durenberger, who won, had the support of the Americans for Democratic Action, but received little support from conservative Republicans, support normally guaranteed for the GOP candidate in Minnesota. Only in Illinois, where Seith faced Percy, does the pattern appear reversed, where a large number of Democrats voted for the more liberal Republican. As Washington Post columnist David Broder noted, every one of these Democrats who had a contested primary chose to run on conservative issues, except for Seith, who lost the AFL-CIO endorsement to Percy. All these Democrats have been able to maintain their conservative positions and still gain endorsements from most unions, from the regular Democratic organizations in their states, and most, if not all, other elected Democrats. These Democrats have sacrificed some black support. Percy, for example, did very well among blacks, but have made deep inroads into the sizable GOP constituencies. One consequence of this trend could well be to encourage the new right to concentrate their efforts on remaking the Democratic Party rather than trying to defeat it from within the GOP. Given the debilitating effects of the new right's kamikaze efforts on the GOP and the success that Democrats have enjoyed by running right-wing candidates, they may have no alternative.